I would like to say this conference has been way too civilized so far, so we'll see if we can stir it out a little bit. I mean, we're talking about reform and opening in this panel. In truth, I think both countries could use some reform and opening. You know, both governments seem to be caught up in their own BS, actually, about victimhood. America is a victim of Chinese policies and stealing our technology and blocking our opportunities here. At the same time, we've got ridiculous politics going on. We're cutting budgets, we're not investing, we're not taking care of workers that get laid off. So we've caused a lot of our own problems. China is wallowing in its own victimhood that because China's rising, the world wants to keep China down and everybody's being unfair to China and China's doing everything right. You know, I think they both need to get over themselves. I think for the US, actually, we're just going through our own cultural revolution right now. We've got a gang of four of Lighthizer, Navarro, Mnuchin, and Kudlow. They don't agree on everything, but they're kind of in the middle of this, bouncing back and forth all the time. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons that this has happened. I've watched China turn the American business community against China. You know, year after year going to Capitol Hill and lobbying for MFN and WTO and a reasonable, you know, on a reasonable path. And what's happened over the last 5-6 years, I've watched the companies peel away, and in their boardrooms, nobody's positive on China. And that wasn't done by the US side. That's universal with Europe also. So getting out of this, I think people got to change the way they're thinking about things. I had my own ideas on this. I think the US and China should rise above the current minor, small board debate and talk about resetting the context of really a global trade. I think one opportunity is they should do a bilateral negotiation to join TPP together. And that could lead to reform here, and it could lead to new rules for the trading system, because the WTO, everybody agrees the WTO is essential, and everybody agrees it doesn't work. And unless that gets fixed, it's gonna get worse and worse. So that's enough for me for a minute. So I would like to, I'm gonna start out, I think, just on the economic level. And Simon, this trade war, whatever you want to call it, what's the effect in both economies now, and what happens if you put on the 25% on the 200 billion in 90 days?
Thank you, Jim. And first of all, I want to say thank you to AmCham for expressing a certain amount of solidarity and inviting me to be on this panel and letting me remain on the panel, because as a matter of fact, I'm a Canadian citizen. So although we're talking about a very fraught Chinese-US bilateral relationship, I feel like I'm sitting at the epicenter of one that is much more fraught at the moment, and I'm glad I'm actually able to be here this morning.
Well, we let Murray King come in too, so.
That's right, but I think he didn't want his name to be mentioned, so he's trying to keep his head below the parapet, as we all are. In terms of the broad economic outlook, I think before discussing the trade war, just to say a little bit about how China is doing. So, you know, the specific GDP growth numbers, of course, you take them with a pinch of salt here, but generally speaking, we're talking about an economy that was growing somewhere near 7% in the first half, somewhere near 6.5% in the second half, and based on the forecasts and what we're seeing right now, especially in the consumer market, it'll be closer to 6% in the first half next year. So by Chinese standards, by global standards, that's terrific. By Chinese standards, that's quite a marked slowdown. Sentiment, of course, has been hit quite hard. We've seen the stock market correct down about 30% from its highs in late January. And then, of course, there's been lots of cries and complaints from the private sector to feel that they're really being stamped on by the government, is not fully respected. I'm sure a lot of you will remember back in August an article that went viral, written by a guy who at that point was not very well known, Xi Jinping, saying that the private sector had done its bit for the economy and it was the time for it to exit the stage. So sentiment has been hit pretty hard. Now, one of the reasons is the trade war. And certainly Donald Trump has taken credit directly for the stock market problems in China. In fact, the bigger reason is really domestic policy. So China is still dealing with unwinding some of the excesses that you can trace back to its response to the financial crisis in 2008. So for the last 2 years, there's been a pretty tough-hitting campaign to deleverage the financial system, to deal with risks in the shadow banking sector. And certainly in 2017, there was a sense in China amongst the regulators that they could have their cake and eat it too, that they could wage this kind of deleveraging campaign, and that somehow the economy would still do incredibly well because you'd just be weeding out the underperforming companies. But what we've seen this year is that there really is an economic price to be paid. So bond defaults have spiked, we've had the stock market problems. So ultimately, it's a domestic-led downturn. It's a policy-led downturn, which means that when you look at the impact of the trade war, first of all, we've not really felt the impact yet in China. If you look at exports to America, that's actually been the brightest spot for Chinese exports globally this year because companies are front-running the tariffs. So the trade war in and of itself has not hit the economy yet. Next year, if they do go to 25% on $200 billion on March 1st, there will be much more of an impact. When very pointy-headed economists try to work out exactly what the numbers are, you get different calculations, and a lot of them will say, well, it's going to be somewhere between 1.2 to 1.4%, which doesn't sound like very much, and in absolute terms, it's not very much. The problem is that the impact on employment would be really quite severe. And already surveys of companies in the big open parts of the Chinese economy, so especially in Guangdong and in Zhejiang, are quite negative. They're quite worried about the outlook. But because you have this policy, domestic policy downturn this year, it means that next year, if you do get blowback from the trade war, China does have quite a few levers that it could pull. So I guess to make the answer short, I would say the trade war would begin to have more of a serious impact next year. But I would also expect much more of a domestic response from China to cushion the downturn. So it's hard to be, just looking at the Chinese economic outlook, it's hard to be overly pessimistic. Because very briefly on the American side, I think one source of confidence now for China, especially based on the meeting after the G20 with Trump, is the knowledge, the absolute certainty that one, the American stock market is beginning to pay attention to the trade war. So you kind of have this sort of lullaby going on for 6 months after the first tariffs, where the stock market wasn't registering any negative impact whatsoever. Clearly that's changed. Now the other point of certainty is that we know that Trump is somebody who's watching the stock market very closely and almost seems to be responding day in, day out to the stock market movements in terms of making nice with China over the trade issue. So I think for next year, if we got to the point that America was to levy those tariffs, I think actually the economic impact in China would be digestible. I think on the American side, the impact on the stock market would be more severe than maybe many have anticipated. And so that I think is actually something that might be a force that pushes America back from the brink.
Oh, thank you for that. That was a great overview. David, I want to ask you about what has been opening or what's not been opening. My colleagues at APCO did a little bit of research on how they're lifting limits on automobiles, for electric and hybrids this year, commercial vehicles 2020, car market 2022. They're lifting some of the restrictions on financial. There's just a whole long list. I've quit listening to this stuff, actually. It falls on deaf ears with me because I've heard so much reform talk out of the Winchell Hall, a lot of reform talk that didn't happen. And I think it falls on a lot of deaf ears now. I think the business community is waiting. But I'm willing to be convinced what's really happening. What's opening, is it really happening?
Yeah. Fundamental question. I think to look at this, it's probably necessary to take a little step back and say, okay, when we talk about China's reforms and what's happening, what does reform mean? And I think we've all sort of rushed past that question over the past 40 years when the table stakes were very, very different, and reform back in the day really did in fact mean let's make ourselves in China look more like Western market economies, because there was such a gap in terms of where the economy was. I think the penny has dropped for many of us in the China observer world over the last 5 years, really looking at what has and hasn't happened post 2013 Third Plenum in reform. And in many ways, I think the realization is that reform doesn't necessarily mean making ourselves look more like Western market economies. Reform means making ourselves stronger and creating a more functioning economy, and Professor Wang alluded to this in his comments, but important to remember that it's not just a market economy with Chinese characteristics, it's in fact a structurally very different economy. So one of the better examples I can think of this is when we hear SOE reform, those Western observers, Western DNA ingrained observers, we hear, oh, okay, make these big, powerful state-owned enterprises operate more by market principles, look more like Western counterparts. In fact, SOE reform has meant let's borrow Western principles, let's govern ourselves to a certain extent by opening up a board seat for a minor investment in an oil major or China Eastern with Delta's investment. Let's borrow governance principles from the West, but let's do that in order to prop them up and give them an unassailable position in the market here to prepare for future global competition. So just one example of, I think, this penny really dropping in terms of what does reform really mean when we say reform. Jim, on your question, you mentioned automotive market. I think it's a very good example if you look at the electric vehicle market and what was initially envisioned and attempted by the China government, which I think has really incredible levers to draw on in its influence in the economy. And I've written and spoken quite a bit on the economy, the government's role as a market maker. And EV is a great example where initially we thought, okay, we China market makers, I guess, thought, this is a different world than the 50-50 equity cap arrangement, the 50-50 JVs that we needed to start automotive making in China with the internal combustible engine. Let's wall this off today and allow the Chinese to get a head start, Chinese manufacturers. And so in the early days of EV, even just 3, 4, 5 years ago, 99% of all EVs manufactured in China were manufactured by Chinese manufacturers. Today, because the government has quote unquote opened that market, not really. What it's done is it's incented the JV makers, because China realized we can't do this on our own. The quality is still low. We haven't learned as much as we thought we did from the development of the traditional automotive market. We need to take action, and we need to continue to bring Western technology and know-how to the development of the EV market. So has that opened? No, not at all. It's just another. It's probably maybe some of your points of a slower pace and a rhetoric around movement or open of markets.
But it also seems that China opens up sectors when they need help. When China needs to learn something, but the goal is to learn and then say goodbye to you. I mean, it's a pretty stark. I mean, now China's opening up healthcare because they need help in healthcare. They're opening up finance because they already own the market, but they need to get best practices going and make Hank Paulson happier. So, are there sincere openings going on? I'm being devil's advocate here.
Yes, there are real openings going on, and yet they're constrained by many of the domestic drags on the economy that Simon mentioned, particularly on consumption, consumer upgrade and spending not happening envisioned as quickly as the government envisioned in this phase of their growth. We are seeing recent openings in the financial market. The insurance positions for Allianz being advanced by, I think, 3 to 4 years over what had been envisioned. The criticism of that is that it was done after there's already an unassailable position by the domestic players. Yet, in fact, I think China is awakening, I think the Chinese government is awakening to some of the sentiment underlying your comments, which is, if we don't move a little bit faster on this, we will lose credibility and no one will believe what we've laid out and allow some of these explanatory factors for why it's been slow around dealing with the complexity of our economy and the movement from investment-led to consumption-led. So we need to get on with it, and we're going to accelerate some of these. So I tend to be long on China, long term, and I do think we'll continue to see an acceleration of some of this, not for goodwill, not to make China look more like the West, but because we must do this in China to advance to the next stage of development, create jobs, and maintain a satisfied and healthy and breathing clean air population.
Thank you. Professor Wang, we let you rest long enough here. If you look at, we've been very dark on U.S.-China, but if you really think about U.S.-China, Americans and Chinese are very compatible people. Entrepreneurial, open-minded, actually think for themselves. Our children get along, they go to school together, they get married. Our businesses get along when they're allowed to do real business. It seems to me we've got a couple of problems. One is the DNA of the two political systems is very, very different. And the way that plays out in our politics causes a lot of friction. We also have a big economic problem now we have an economic conflict. The economy used to be the ballast in the relationship because it was complementary. China got know-how, capital, investment. The U.S. got low-cost labor, inexpensive goods. It kept inflation down, especially during a time of stagnant wages. But now both economies are going for the same thing. They're going for the technologies of the future. You're a political scientist, so you should be able to fix this. Now, is there if you look at the Chinese political system, Lu Xuntai, one of the great political scholars, he said that in order to become the top leader of China, you've got to have the least international experience. Because if you have too much international experience, your thinking is tainted by the West. You're losing your Chinese-ness. Now, going forward, will there be more internationally minded Chinese leaders, or are we where we are? Is this going to persist because of the political culture?
Thank you for your question. I think you're right. I point out the people of the two countries are practical. And I think we have a lot of pleasant experience of staying with each other, making friends with each other. So I think all relations, even though I'm politically pessimistic, I think a people-to-people relationship can be part of a strong base for the relationship. Yeah, so I think that is true. Not to mention the growing the common interests over the last 40 years. Right? So I think that is some people talk about the decoupling of the two economies to destroy so-called China America. Right? I think that is a concept coined by some scholars in the U.S. Right? So I think that is a lot of strengths, forces to put together the two countries. Second point, I think you're right. That you're talking about the differences of political DNA. Yeah, we have seen that that is might be one of the big problems leading to the quarrels of the disputes between the two countries. Especially in the United States, for example, a lot of moderates, liberal, so I think they have got disappointed about the changes, the directions in China in the last 5 years. A lot of people, we know for a long time, friends with each other, exchange with each other, right? But I'm happy to say, in the recent weeks, we have more this kind of people come back to visit us. So I think what we need, I think, is to continue to talk to each other.
The deputy chief of mission in Washington gave a speech the other day where it was the first time I've heard a Chinese official say, we've made some mistakes. I mean, we heard it from Deng Xiaoping today, but you don't hear it from leadership, but the DCM gave a speech in Washington where he said, we've overdone our own nationalism. I mean, do you think we'll start seeing more of China admitting that maybe they had something to do with this problem being solved?
Yes, I think that is, in the first sessions, I think Scott mentioned the sensitivity to domestic politics. But in the last 5 years, there's the time to change. But I think a lot of things driven by domestic politics. Right? So I think when the people, the friends in the US, I think it's very important to remember this and to try to cultivate sensitivities to the changes of Chinese domestic politics. So I think very, very important, a very special moment. I said, all this, we talk about the political changes in the US, big changes, sea changes in China too. Right? So all these things, all these factors, we work together to make relations so difficult at the moment. Right? But I think we need to talk. So a lot of noises, right, have been made, but it might be due to the considerations to domestic politics.
Simon,
Yeah.
Hank Paulson gave a speech down in Singapore at the Bloomberg Forum recently, and one line he said that I remember is that you can't decouple if you're not a couple. And this isn't a couple. There's America and China are just two countries. What about Europe? And if this really gets going, what do other countries? They have to choose sides. I think Lighthizer does really have an agenda of doing some serious decoupling. And the supply chains that are moving to Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, and Mexico. They're not going to the U.S. But I'm not sure he's unhappy about that. I think he wants to maybe even pay back China a bit. So what does this mean for the rest of the world? U.S. and China are not going to get over ourselves, but we've got all these other countries that are on the sidelines and could face some problems, which we're actually seeing in Canada right now.
I think the decoupling idea is it's very attractive in the sense that it's a simple idea, but I think it is quite a simplistic idea. So we can wrap our heads around it, but when you actually look at the details of how it would be achieved, it's not something that can actually be done. Not easily, at least without causing massive repercussions, not just for the rest of the world, but also for the two combatants. So yes, supply chains are beginning to migrate away, certainly at the lower value end of the chain. But at the mid to higher value end, you still have lots of companies that are looking to onshore their operations here. And to the extent that the US really does pursue a decoupling strategy, China can make quite strong moves to basically force companies to, if you want to sell into the consumer market here, if you want to sell mobile phones here, you've got to have a certain amount of your supply chain onshore as well. So if it really does get pushed to the extreme, I would expect a fairly strong pushback from the China side as well. And I think it's worth bearing in mind, as Scott was laying out in his earlier presentation, if you look at the 2005 speech by Zelig, the responsible stakeholder comment, depending on what metric you use, you can look at lots of ways in which actually America and China are a couple. Maybe it's a bit self-centric to just view them as one single couple when there are lots of other countries involved. But whether you look at collaboration, certainly in the Obama administration on the environmental issue, on the Iran issue, there are multiple areas in which they have worked together with other countries. this discussion which you do hear every now and again about the idea that the TPP, now that it's actually going to be going into force on December 30th, in several years' time, under a different administration, the door would be open for America to come back into it. And this is what I understand is often said in DC, is that there's no way under the Trump administration that would happen. But Lighthizer apparently has said that people come back in 4 years. So encouraging Japan to go ahead, lead the world, lead the 11 countries back into TPP, keeping the door open to America's re-entry, which by extension would then mean that the door is also open to China's eventual entry. So I'm very skeptical that decoupling can be achieved in the short term. I think looking at the medium to long term, I think coupling and recoupling will actually be the longer trend. And it's clearly going to be a very bumpy period, but I think that's where things are headed. From the Chinese side, clearly there's been a recognition that they have to resume the reform and opening. And this is really the narrative that you hear now being pushed in Beijing. I was at a big reform and opening conference this past weekend at Tsinghua. There wasn't so much an acknowledgement of China having made mistakes, but what I did hear, which for a lot of foreigners is kind of a common narrative, but it was new to me to hear this coming from quite high-ranking Chinese advisors, was the comment that we have not been doing reform and opening for the last 10 years. We had forgotten about it. But under the new administration, now that we're in a new era, there is newfound momentum for this kind of thing. So I think you're seeing a situation which is actually very dynamic. And so that's why on the decoupling side, I'm just not as pessimistic as some other people.
Yeah, you bring that up, but as I told you, I'm very skeptical when I hear about reform, but I think what would catch my attention is if the leadership started talking about it's time to finally enact the Third Plenum. Because that was really from the China 2030 report from the DRC and the World Bank.
I mean, the problem, just to very briefly, the problem with the Third Plenum is, and this gets to the fundamentals of the political economic system in China, is that when you look at the text, and everybody's seized on that one line about making market forces decisive and allocating resources. But number one, if you look at it, there's not a single mention of the private sector. It's only ever referred to as the non-public sector. So, how do you define the public sector? How do you define the non-public sector? It's the absence of something. So it's a very kind of negative definition of what the private sector is. And then secondly, along with saying that there'd be market forces, they also talk about strengthening the state. And I think this is this is really a domestic issue. Obviously, there's big foreign spillovers in terms of what China does with its policy, but when you have Xi Jinping coming out now and protesting that we love the private sector, we want to see the private sector do well, it's done under this context of, the formulation is often described as the two unwaverings. So the two unwaverings are the unwavering support for the private sector and the unwavering support for a strong state sector. And the fundamental issue is that so long as you still want to have that strong state sector, as David was laying out, it's going to be very difficult to have the private sector thrive, and you're always going to have that kind of level of suspicion and concern. It's quite fun. I'm not sure if you saw it a couple of weeks ago, the party secretary from Zhejiang gave a speech where he was again trying to offer his support for the private sector, and the term that he used was something like 民营企业要搞香香，民营经济要搞壮壮. And so the 香香壮壮 formulation is, making private companies fragrant, making the private sector big and strong. But then a lot of Chinese listeners heard that and they said, that typically is what farmers say when they're talking about butchers. Butchers, when they're talking about trying to fatten up a pig. And if you're trying to fatten up the pig, ultimately what you want to do is you want to fatten up for slaughter. So you've got this kind of fundamental issue with, even when the government starts to offer support for the private sector, it's very difficult to do it in a way that really allays these kinds of suspicions and fears. And that's an issue that I think goes well beyond the trade war and gets to the fundamentals of the system.
David, you got something to say.
Yeah.
After David's remarks, I'm going to go to the audience, because you guys are out in the field. You've got lots of information on your own. We'll welcome questions and some short comments, because it's about reform and opening. I think we'd like to know what you're seeing in reform and opening in your sectors with your companies, but no long speeches.
Yeah, I wanted to comment briefly on this, the concept of decoupling, which is really, really important. And I think many people in this room are getting phone calls from Washington via your headquarters today about what if you were to decouple your supply chain from its existing base in China. I think there's a real elemental underappreciation of the complexity of doing that, as Simon alluded to. I had to significantly re-educate myself over the last couple of years just to better understand the tensions that are happening today and go spend more time in Washington and understand why only suddenly did the concept of economic security become a key contributing point to the U.S.'s definition of national security. And I can assure you, I've asked past and present national security officials why that is, and they don't have a good answer, but the fact is only today has that actually become a contributing element of economic security, become a contributing element of national security. The underappreciation point of decoupling and impact on supply chains here is, number one, the investment base that exists for so many of the companies already here. This isn't done overnight, it's not done easily, and this is an enormous market that American companies want today and in the future to be able to benefit from and be close to. And many of these actions, if they're taken, can be very difficult to reverse. It's not just a switch we flip. Probably the best example is soybeans and the actions taken with the Soviet Union during the invasion of Afghanistan and the trade embargoes and so on. And if you look at the U.S. position in soybeans as an export market, it's number one or number two in virtually every major country in the world except for the Soviet Union, where they rapidly replaced their source of supply for that particular commodity, and it hasn't come back in decades since. So I think it's important that this idea of decoupling is really complex and could have enormous impacts on the economic relationship.
You know, you bring up soybeans. Ian showed me a news story this morning. They have finally started making some orders for soybeans. So those of you worried about the price of mapo tofu going up can relax for a while. Okay, let's turn it to the audience. Again, welcome questions and some short comments. Yes. Keep your hand up so she knows where to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really excellent points that you all made. It's Jumana Saliheen, by the way, from CRU International. I just had a question. We've heard a lot about the fundamental causes running over 30 years, the last 5 years. But if you had to choose the single most important thing which led us to where we are today, I'd be really interested in trying to pinpoint that. And the second,
Where we are in what respect?
just with the trade war and the tensions and prospects going forward, like what is the one thing? And then secondly, I'm looking for empowerment, and I guess we're all here today. I wanted to know if there's anything that we as individuals could be doing to change the path of where we go. So not just leaving it up to the leaders. What could we be doing? So I think that's really important.
The only pinpoint thing I see is that things were going well until Ken Jarrett said he was retiring from AmCham. And who wants to take those questions? I'll tell you what, I think we'd like to hear what the foreigner thinks, but I also would like to see what you think about what is the key point that led to this change. And we might. No.
How would I say, for the first question, I think the misunderstanding. All the more accurate word is complexity. Yes, the situation becomes so complex. I want to say the complex misunderstanding may lead to the problems of today.
Anybody else have thoughts on that?
I would echo that and say it's domestic politics on both sides. I think the Morning did an excellent job of making a point on the difference between where China was when many of the foundational elements of our economic relationship were put in place a few decades ago and where China is today, and that power balance shifting. And I think there's many things that need to be done and can be done well from a principle standpoint, speaking from the US side, in terms of equal market access, reciprocity, those things. I think in some cases where we're doing things that don't adhere to American principles around the benefits of free trade and things like that, such as punitive tariffs, I think those are done for other reasons. I couldn't speak to why they're done. We'd have to ask making those decisions. But it seems from afar that it's political calculations domestically, and I think that drives a lot of China's decision making too in a very different system, of course.
I think it's the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis really shifted China's thinking in that, well, maybe our system is better. And, we've gotten through the Asian financial crisis, we're getting through this. Our system may be better. And then also the economic implications of that in the US and what it did to all kinds of people losing their wealth and jobs, and also what it did here and what it led to in politics. To me, that's the biggest turning point I've seen in many years. All right, next question, please. We didn't pay either of these people, right? They're the two questioners here.
Hi, I'm Anurag Gupta again from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. I spent half the day and I'm wondering, I haven't heard the phrases OBOR or BRI, one mode, and is that not important enough in the context, or is it a bit too controversial? And I would love to hear all of your opinions on how it's affecting relationships across the world.
We can only deal with one quagmire at a time here. Anybody want to bring up Belt and Road?
Well, you didn't hear OBOR because that's no longer the correct nomenclature. So it is now the BRI. Obviously it's in some ways a bit of a Rorschach test. Depending on who you are when you look at it, you'll come to a radically different conclusion. So people who are extremely pessimistic about China's trajectory and what it's trying to do with the world, of course, see this as China trying to be an empire builder. People who are much more skeptical about China's governance structure will say it's a total mess. If it is a debt trap, it's an unintentional debt trap. They don't actually really know what they're doing. And I think the truth probably falls, to be a kind of a bit of a cop-out answer here, I think the truth falls somewhere between these two poles. It's still very, very early days. We know that what's happened within the administration in China is that virtually every bit of foreign policy has been lumped under the BRI umbrella. So it's still a very, very inchoate and ill thought through and muddled policy. And on the American side, in terms of the concern about where China is going, this is seen as something to obviously be very worried and wary about. I think what's really important is, we're talking about the China-US relationship, but ultimately in terms of how BRI develops, this really will get down to China's relationship with other countries. And we've seen really, really strong pushback, more than China was expecting over the past year, whether in Pakistan with the CPEC, the Economic Corridor, Sri Lanka with the nationalization of the Hambantota port, Myanmar as well with the pipeline. So there's an increasing amount of pushback. And in terms of what appears to be what we've discussed, the turn towards somewhat greater humility in Beijing over their foreign policy and their ambitions and what they can actually achieve, I think this pushback from other countries around the region is a really, really important contributing factor. So it's not just a trade war, it's the awareness that this BRI policy is not actually panning out as the most optimistic Chinese thinkers had hoped.
I think what BRI shares with what we're talking about in Made in China 2025 is just, they're both an overreach. I think they both show great ambition and a country that's thinking forward and planning, but they've gotten way out over their skis. It's just they've overreached beyond the abilities to carry it out and overreached beyond what the rest of the world is going to accept from China at this point. Next question, you got
real quick, as an American, if there's anything the Chinese can do to help my country build better infrastructure, I'm all for it. And if Jim talked about changing the game around some global collaboration, maybe that's one.
I think if they make some Trump hotels BRI, the whole thing's fixed.
Hi. So, thanks very much for your remarks. I was on the AmCham Shanghai DC door knock the last 2 years, and there's something that David and Jim both said that really struck me that I think in some ways we've been spending the last 30 years or last 15 years trying to change China to be more like us, but in some ways I think they've changed us to be a little bit more like them, and there's two things that come to mind with that. The one is when we were on the door knock and we went to go in to visit the Department of Defense to talk to them about CFIUS, we said, hey, China looks at cybersecurity as a national resource. They've got to protect their internet. And then when you ask them about, the foreigners can't know where the oil fields are in China because that's energy security. They can't know where the cornfields are in China because that's food security. So I think we have a different idea of what national security is. But they actually respond, well, we have the same idea. So obviously now when we do CFIUS reviews, there's going to be a closer review of the food chain and a closer review of the energy chain and everything like that. And then also when Jim was talking about the sense of kind of national victimization, Donald Trump has really tapped into that. We've been humiliated by all these trade deals. And that's, I think, another lesson that's sort of been learned to us from China. So David and Jim, I wanted to hear a little bit more of your remarks. If you could expand on that in your remarks in your talks with American government people about how some of the Chinese rhetoric has kind of seeped its way into now what we're thinking on our side.
Well, just quickly, this hasn't happened instantaneously. This has been going on for years. Companies have been going to Washington for years and saying, I got this real problem where I'm being blocked in China or I'm having this cyber attacks or this or that. And then the government say, what do you want me to do? Well, then they would say, don't do anything, don't do anything. I don't want to mess up my current market share in China. And, so, China was smart enough to give some of the big companies enough market share here that they would push back in Washington. And now what's happened is we just reached the tipping point on that with Donald J. Trump, and that just reached a tipping point, and now but this has been going on a long, long time. I think should we just go to the next question?
This is the interview from International Paper. We're not news media. We are US-based manufacturer of paper and pulp, so don't worry. Question to Professor Wang. Just recently, I have a lot of communications with Chinese scholars, and many of them think that in recent years, China has not done enough in terms of reform and opening up. And some of them even think that in some areas, they're going backward. My question is that, because many of them told me that, my question is that consensus among the academia in China? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Yang, for these questions. Yeah, also, as I pointed in my presentation, I said that is all these issues, changes, and implications. I think that is people are divided. Like driven by, I think that is very similar to the situation in the US and elsewhere, ideology. Yeah, so I think that is a lot of things. Ideology dominate our so observations and understandings. So I think we, as I said, we need rebuild the consensus. So I think that is we rely upon the traditional wisdom, like a golden mean, right? So not to go to extremes. We need diversity. We need to talk to each other and to dialogue, conversation, and to find consensus on this. Yeah. So I think identity politics can play very bad here and elsewhere. Yeah. So I think that is something I'm quite worried about, especially for this country and for US-China relations. Yeah.
Scott. you stayed awake through our whole panel, and so I'm complimenting you on that. And I'd like to hear what you think about this reform and opening topic. Give Scott a microphone.
Thanks for the extra pressure. And, it's funny, I've been in China only a few days. I haven't had any jet lag. I think what happens is I'm just on China time all the time, regardless of where I am. And it shows that adaptability already. And I don't know what's going to happen when I go home next week. I think it's interesting that we are seeing potential signs of change here. I don't know if you're asking more about what the consensus is amongst experts or the Chinese government, which one you want to hear.
Well, I'd like to hear, because you're coming from Washington and you're talking to officials all the time. And I know the sentiments have changed actually very strongly, especially in the Congress. Where do you see this going next? I mean, how much, can Trump do a deal that just opens up, soybeans and other products? Or does there have to be, a major change in the way China looks at Made China 2025? Is there a way towards a solution that the political establishment in Washington will go along with?
I think the short answer is yes, if it's a big enough volume with enough paid up front. Certainly some of the things that we've been hearing the Chinese talk about, debating, the way China makes policy changes is they give big speeches on big issues, speeches that are very long, and we're going to see some of those speeches and documents that are very long that set out general guidance, and then that's followed up by specifics. There's still reason to be skeptical that some of the conversation is going to translate, but you could not get China to make big promises on all of the individual things if they didn't first go through the larger conversation and the top leadership analysis. So I think the next week or two, we should be watching and checking boxes that when Xi Jinping gives a speech to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Third Plenum, that he mentions big ideas like competitive neutrality and some of these other concepts. And then there's the Central Economic Work Conference, which is going to identify China's successes and failures and what it needs to work on, and for potentially a fourth plenum, which is then supposed to tell the Communist Party authoritatively the direction the country is supposed to go in. And then that's a good foundation for negotiations. And so I see the likely trip of Leopold and others early in January, Washington, as the right ordering of how this is supposed to go. My sense is that with that, January is be pivotal. Because if you get to February 5th and no deal, and no prospect of a deal, you're then in the Spring Festival. And that raises anxieties here. And it'll be very difficult in those next 3 weeks to get some done. So for me, I would say this time next month, we ought to have a pretty good sense of whether we're on track or whether it's just a moving year.
Professor Wang, do you have any idea who has Xi Jinping's ear now? I mean, is he listening to Liu He, or is he listening to Wang Qishan? And give us the inside story. I know.
Yes, I have a lot of inside stories. Yeah, I think, a lot of people talking about implications of the 19th Party Congress and 2 sessions this year. I think the media hasn't yet paid attention to 2 things. Okay, one is the structural and institutional adjustment. That is insufficiently, right? That is the strengthening the party power, right? But we look at the role of Liu He. Liu He, I find it as a person like him, right? Educated in the US, has the master's degree from Harvard. to appoint it as the key economic advisor in the I think re-strengthened institution. Okay, that is that's not the leading group on the financial affairs, right? So that is a committee. Okay, that's something the comparable to that economic arm within the National Security Council, within the White House. So I think that is I think that's important. So that is U.S. is still something a very good example. China learned, like James mentioned. Okay, the China the after the global financial crisis. Okay, China more confidence. I think that is second things I think pointed our colleague at Peking University. Right, that is Mr. Dr. Yong. Right, pointed to the positions of the People's Bank of China. So that is also another very good case. Okay, the person having the U.S. the PhDs, right? They got the political trust. So I think that is two cases symbolic. I think the top leaders like to send to outside, pressure to the U.S. And China like to keep the good economic relations with the U.S.
To your point of what America is learning from China, we've learned what the Lindao Shaozu, because Trump is a Lindao Shaozu all on his own right now. Why don't we let the two of you have a final comment and we'll wrap this up. Simon, talk about anything you want.
Talk about the Ottawa Senators, my hometown hockey team, and their struggles. In terms of the Chinese-U.S. relationship, I mean, look, I think it's a cliche. It's the darkest hour before the dawn. I'm not predicting that next year is going to bring a great new dawn. I do think, though, it is. When you look at the beginning of the market wobbles and the economic troubles in America, it leads me to believe that they pushed the tariff strategy pretty much as far as they can. So it's possible that there's not going to be a great grand new bargain by March 1st. But I would bet heavily against there being the 25% on the 200 plus the additional tariffs on the 267, because I think that the ramifications for the American economy would be extremely severe. My people give Trump a little bit of credit for having brought attention to these long-standing American complaints and saying this is finally moving forward, long delayed reforms in China. And that's, true to a point, certainly. I do think it's worth having a counterfactual in our minds, which is, had it been Clinton who was elected, had America gone into the TPP, had that gone into force, what kinds of pressures would that have placed on the Chinese economy? I think it's entirely possible that you'd be in a situation where China is undertaking a lot of the similar reforms, but in a much less antagonistic environment. And so I guess my great hope for American foreign policy going forward, and maybe Trump is not going to be the ideal vessel for this, is that they rediscover ways to place that kind of pressure on China, but in a way that's less antagonistic, that's less potentially disastrous for the global economy.
More of an incentive to change.
Exactly. More carrot, less stick.
David, you're going to have the last word.
I'll draw on incentives there, and it ties in a question I think we failed to ask earlier, which is what can we all in this room do, right? What can we do to make all this a little bit better? So with President Bush's recent, I did a little reading on past presidents in China. There's a great comment from President Nixon, who had his flaws, but his flaws weren't lack of strategic thinking about America's relationship with China. He first broached that topic, I learned in 1953 on a trip to Malaysia, and then put it in place decades later. And looking back on the achievements in resetting the relationship with China in his memoirs, so he's no longer president, but looking back, he made a comment, something to the effect of, during the Cold War, these countries were brought together out of fears, right, as a strategic balance against Russia. He said, in the period post-peace, we need new economic incentives that bind us together by hope. And Simon just mentioned TPP, other elements there. I think if you look at the incredible needs here and there, I mentioned infrastructure, there's healthcare, there's environmental cleanliness, there's food security and safety and so on, all these areas where American companies have such fantastic technology and know-how, much of it actually created here. And this market has so much opportunity that I think we need to think differently going forward about new sorts of economic models, new sorts of cooperation in China for the world. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity if we can just sort of push through some of these politics that are driving what I hope are short-term tensions. I shouldn't say short-term tensions, but we're going to have a tense relationship for a while, but there's also a lot that can be done under the surface of that.
Thank you, David. So we're going to end the panel with a call for the return to the audacity of hope. Thank you all.